Please take your seats, fasten your seat belts for our final round, and I would say another highlight of our today's workshop. Just a second. Just a second. I have to switch off. What is that? So, once again, welcome everybody to the closing session of our all-day workshop, Rethinking Liberalism, and a special welcome to Timothy Garton-Ash. I see at least that you are online, Timothy, right? But still muted. Could you please activate your microphone, Timothy? Hello. Can you hear us? Maybe we should call him. Do you have a... I have a look. One more call for Timothy Garton-Ash, the speaker of our final session. Maybe he's not at his computer, so we will wait for a minute or two. I'll have a look if I have a telephone number. His email. Could you send him an email? Timothy, now we can see you.
Great, and I can hear you.
So, welcome again to our final session of our hybrid workshop, offline and online. We had at least in my perception, extremely rich and interesting and substantial debate on several aspects of our general topic, rethinking liberalism. To quote you with the speech you gave 2 years ago at our annual reception, what went wrong with liberalism and what should liberals do about it, with a lot of aspects you are familiar with, the anti-liberal counter-revolution as a reaction to the success story of liberalism, but also to the shortcomings and failures of the liberal revolution, especially since 1989, 1990. Some key issues and some key words of our previous discussion. What are liberal answers to free-floating feelings of fear and insecurity? What about a kind of compassionate liberalism, being aware of the need of social coherence and a basic sense of solidarity and mutual obligation, providing a kind of basic security in times of fundamental and rapid change, and having a sense of responsibility also for social coherence, a liberalism of hope, providing a sense of confidence that we are able to shape the future and not just being object to the developments which are out of our democratic control. And this, of course, is very much also about restoring or improving the ability of liberal democracies to act, to shape these basic developments we are facing, from climate change, economic globalization, the digital revolution, intercontinental migration, to give really policy answers to these challenges. We also had been debating the international aspect, the new global competition between authoritarian powers and liberal democracies, and maybe finally how to combine the openness to change and a positive attitude and eagerness to innovation with the need of kind of basic security, stability, also in terms of individual biographies, and how to empower individuals, how to empower people to keep pace with the structural changes we are facing, and which probably will be even accelerate in the next 2 or 3 decades to come, given that we are living in an historical era of fundamental change. So this is, of course, very roughly and not at all comprehensive, such some notions on our previous discussions. And now we are very much looking forward to your introduction to our final discussion towards the new liberalism. Please, Timothy, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Ralph. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you earlier today. And I can see I'm going to pick up on several things you've already started discussing. My intention is to be ruthlessly and telegraphically prescriptive, to basically address the question, what should we do? And to throw a bunch of ideas at you and then open up for the discussion. But let me just throw out one initial question, which seems to me an interesting one. It's one that wouldn't have occurred to me, but when I present on this subject, a lot of our students come back and ask this question, which is, why liberalism? Why hang on to a term which to them seems so compromised and is also so confusing? Because as we know, liberals for the American rights means socialists, if not communists, and liberals for the French left means conservatives. Why hang on to the term liberalism at all, rather than, say, talking about liberal communitarianism, for example? Follow Michael Walzer's idea of just using it as an adjective. My pushback to that is, number one, liberalism is the set of theories and practices which has liberty at its center. And number two, it's precisely the more than 200-year history of contestation, of theory and practice, of trial and error, which makes it worth continuing to focus the argument around liberalism, including the search for a new liberalism, which is, of course, a very old activity. As you all know, the first new liberalism was more than 100 years ago, in the late 19th, early 20th century. One might argue after 1945, we had a new liberalism. And then, of course, we had neoliberalism, which I would insist is also a new liberalism. The key is in the name. So it's almost intrinsic to the method of liberalism to be constantly looking for the new liberalism. So having said that, I'm going to take 3 baskets, like the Helsinki Final Act, and talk about things we might need to do in each of the three baskets. My three baskets are, first of all, old but somewhat neglected liberal truths. Secondly, what you mentioned, Ralph, lessons from the mistakes of the last 30 years, 30 to 40 years. And thirdly, responding to new challenges. I'm going to be very brief on the first one, but it's just worth saying that if you're in Poland or Hungary, or to some extent even in Boris Johnson's Britain and Donald Trump US, then defending classical goods of political liberalism, limited government, checks and balances, rule of law, equality before the law, civil society, anti-majoritarian institutions, which are, of course, the ones populists always attack, free speech, including uncensored, diverse, and trustworthy media, those classic old truths of political liberalism are the ones we need to defend. And, for example, it seems to me the future of liberal democracy in Poland today, the most crucial question for the future of liberal democracy in Poland is the future of independent media. So that's basket one. Basket two, I'm sure you've been talking about it a lot, lessons from the mistakes of the last 30 to 40 years. Here, for me, the classic text, if you like, the Bibelstelle, is a sentence of Pierre Asner's from the magazine Esprit in 1991, where Pierre, I think with brilliant prescience, wrote, "As we celebrate the triumph of liberty and universality, we must not forget the yearnings and aspirations that led to nationalism and socialism." And then he names the two pairs, solidarity and equality, and community and identity. And in my book, we can organize a lot of the lessons from the last 30 years around those two pairs, solidarity and equality, community and identity. Solidarity and equality, I mean, the obvious point to make at the beginning, which you're all aware of, is that the inequality is multidimensional. It is by no means simply captured by economic inequality, let alone by income inequality. Even in the economic category, wealth, property inequality is more important, I would argue, than income inequality, because it's also intergenerational inequality. That inequality also, of course, expresses itself as an inequality not just of life chances, but of life expectancy. Dramatic differences. For example, in one British city, life expectancy in the poorer part of the city is 58 for men, 83 in the richest part of the same city. The same is true in the United States. Vertical, but also horizontal. So the geographical aspect of inequality is clearly absolutely crucial. The Rust Belt, East Germany, East and Southeast Poland, the north of England. Cultural inequality, both the educational inequality between those who have higher education and those who don't, and what I call the inequality of attention and respect. And last but not least, the inequality of power between particularly the rich and poor. So it's this, and incidentally, not just public power, but crucially also private power. So it's this multidimensional inequality. Here, it seems to me, a few things we could think of doing to address this problem. Number one, there has to be a strong element of redistribution. I would say go after the tax havens, which have more than $9 trillion in them by most estimates. A wealth tax, a digital tax. Amazon in Britain this year made more than 13 billion pounds and paid, wait for it, under £1,000 in tax. A British dustman paid more tax than Amazon. A land tax, which is a very interesting idea endorsed by The Economist, because a land tax goes after both vertical and horizontal, i.e. geographical inequality. Number two, what Ralph Dahrendorf called the common flaw. We did a poll the other day with EU opinions of the Bertelsmann Foundation. 71% of Europeans now support a UBI, Universal Basic Income. I think the idea of a universal minimal inheritance is also a very interesting one, actually, because, as I said, the problem is often the lack of wealth. Those who have the bank of mum and dad and those who don't, right? Universal basic services, obviously. Thirdly, issues of ownership, moves towards stakeholder capitalism, but also, in my view, crucially for a new liberalism, competition policy. One of the key problems of our time is, again, monopoly. Google, Facebook, huge monopolies. Monopoly is a classic problem for liberals, also, by the way, for libertarians. Fourthly, the geographical component has to be addressed. This is something the British government is at least in principle onto. Leveling up is a good idea. And this also brings a strong component of something which is traditional to liberalism, which is localism, a belief in the importance of local self-government. Fifth, I would say doing something about educational inequality. In the top American universities, according to one recent study, 60% of those admitted came from the top 1% by household income. Absolutely spectacular figure. Not quite as bad in Britain, but still bad. Someone coined the nice term hereditary meritocracy. Hereditary meritocracy. Better on the continent of Europe, but still an issue. Six, doing something about parity of esteem, the inequality of attention and respect. Many of the things I mentioned are already actions in that direction, but I think there's also a symbolic politics about it, and I think there's really important stuff to be done by the media in reporting the neglected other half of our societies. Last but not least, and I think most difficult, is the inequality of power. It seems to me fair to say that we have in many mature democracies, certainly Britain and the United States, something close to a corporate, plutocratic, oligarchic stranglehold on the state. And I think a really fundamental challenge to new liberalism is to try and break open that stranglehold. Of course, if you did all of those things, you would be going a very long way towards solidarity. The second half of my second basket, community and identity. You mentioned it already, Ralph. I'll be very brief. In sort of telegraphic summary, you could say that one mistake many of us liberals made over the last 30 years is to spend so much of our time looking quite rightly at the problems of the other half of the world, but not enough looking at the problems of the other half of our own societies. And when we did, we tended to look at minority groups, multiculturalism, identity politics, rather than the white working class or other majority. And as you rightly said, the sheer speed and depth of change, what Marx, of course, famously predicted in the Communist Manifesto, all that is solid melts into air. Globalization, liberalization, Europeanization, digitalization, all coming at once until people just cry. And you mentioned free-floating fears of insecurity. Too much, too fast. We just please slow down. That, by the way, it was a crucial component in the Brexit vote. More important, in my view, than the peculiarities of English history. What do we do about it? First of all, liberal patriotism. Liberal patriotism has to be an important part of the answer. We left talk of the nation to the right, and often the far right. And this goes to Carolina Vigora's point earlier today. I've heard her make it before about the importance of emotions. This is how liberals speak to emotions around community and identity. by advancing a liberal patriotism, one that is civic, open, and inclusive. And by the way, if you look at what Keir Starmer, the new leader of the Labour Party, has been doing, it goes in exactly this direction, and I think very successfully. But also, and of course my list is not comprehensive here, what Joachim Gauck wonderfully called zielwahrende Entschleunigung, goal-protecting deceleration, better in German. I think we have to face up to the fact that given this really strong social reaction, we do have to think of, while preserving the goal, the overall direction, some slowing of the speed of change. That, of course, applies to managing immigration. By the way, Macron's L'Europe qui protège goes very much in this direction. But that brings me to my third basket, which is the global challenge. And I want to already highlight at this point that what we do in the first two baskets can be in a difficult tension with what we need to do in the third basket when we face the new global challenges, right? So obviously, everyone talks about defending the liberal international order. That we can agree on. That's the part of the first basket in the third. You mentioned, Ralph, the competition with China above all, because essentially the ideological competition is now with the Chinese model of, putting it kindly, developmental authoritarianism, which has huge traction in many parts of the world. In one sense, I think this is actually very good for us. The lack of global ideological competition after 1989 is one reason we got lazy and hubristic. Konkurrenz belebt das Geschäft. So it's actually a good thing to have a strong ideological competition. And in fact, it's a powerful incentive, as during the Cold War, to improve the attractiveness of our own systems for our own societies. But of course, at the same time as this competition, we have to be cooperating on a scale not seen in the first Cold War to address challenges like the global interconnection. COVID is an obvious example of that. Addressing climate change, all the challenges of the Anthropocene, and by the way, artificial intelligence, which carries very significant dangers of a new insecurity between East and West, because the danger is that Chinese and American AI systems will autonomously evolve separately from each other. Then, of course, climate change, you mentioned it already. What's the green liberalism? My view on this is that there is much too much easy talk about a Green New Deal, which somehow magically addresses the concerns in the second basket while also solving climate change. The trade-offs are much, much more difficult than that. My colleague at Oxford, Dieter Helm, has just published a book called Net Zero, which argues that we shouldn't be looking at our net emissions, net zero in emissions. The crucial thing is our overall carbon consumption, including all the carbon used in the production of the goods that we import. And that's a far, far more challenging target. And then, of course, thirdly, and again, the list is not at all comprehensive, if already we have the absolute scandal of what we have seen on the island of Lesbos, with people being put into camps in appalling conditions again, in Europe in 2020, camps behind barbed wire in appalling conditions. That is nothing compared to what we're going to see with the already unavoidable impact of climate change on the global south, in particular on Africa, which is going to produce not thousands, but hundreds and thousands, if not millions of people trying to get to Europe across the Mediterranean. And I think this is a really difficult challenge for a new liberalism, because one can see a set of mutually compatible answers in basket 1 and 2, which actually involve a certain reinforcement of the frontier around the liberal democratic nation state or the liberal democratic European Union. The frontier, what happens at the frontier, has always been a problem in the whole history of liberalism. But what then happens at the frontier? If we have these tens and hundreds of thousands of people trying to come in, but because of our concerns about community and identity, solidarity and equality, we are doing Zielware and Entschleunigung. I don't have a good answer to that, but I think a new liberalism has to address it. At the very least, we should be paying much, much more attention to development policy. For me, the scandal of the German budget is not that Germany doesn't do 2% on defense. I'm not so worried about that. It is that last year it didn't even make 0.7% on official development aid. Frankly, I think as liberals, we should be arguing for 1% on development aid and then a much smarter development policy. Very last comment, and then I'll very much looking forward to hear what everyone else has to say. Each of these baskets and the tasks within them is in itself challenging enough. But what is much more challenging is to put them together and to find mutually compatible policy approaches in these three baskets, particularly in the tension between basket 2 and basket 3. Rhetorically, it's very easy to say we must do A, B, C, and D, but the challenge is to do A, B, and C, and D simultaneously in mutually compatible ways. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Ralph, and look forward to comments from the rest of the group.
Thank you very much, Timothy, for this very powerful outline. It was almost a programmatical speech for a kind of universal liberal party. And I hope it will resonate also in the political sphere. I will refrain from starting to comment, but invite our participants here in Berlin and in the World Wide Web to jump in with comments and answers. Who wants to open the discussion? Lasha, please introduce yourself briefly because Timothy was not there when we had our introductory round.
Yeah, my name is Lasha Tolushi. I'm from Georgia, and I'm director of Georgian think tank, Liberal Academy, Tbilisi. I have two questions. First one is about media. You just mentioned media, and I want to ask you how you see future of media, because media as usual everywhere is very polarized. Sometimes it's under the political parties, under the some government, and this is quite problematic, especially in Eastern Europe, in other countries also. And I ask you how you see modernization. Maybe this word is to use this word is better. And second one is about Russia. I have a question to you. How you see the role of Russia in regard of anti-liberal discussions, and what do you say about it? Because I know it's a lot of problems comes from Kremlin, and what do you think, and what's your opinion about? Thank you very much.
We will collect some contributions. Who wants to join the discussion? Michael Zürn, please. Wolfgang Merkel, Michael Zürn. Okay, we are collecting some votes.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for a wonderful talk. That is a real powerful program. Maybe we should just go back to our desk and work on it instead of discussing it further. But nevertheless, I mean, I would like to ask two questions, just pushing you a little bit further because it was so interesting about the how. I mean, you referred already to the how by saying some of those goals may be not fully compatible with each other. But nevertheless, I mean, even if you focus on simple goals, I know there were moments in history when political systems were able to create more equality, but your point, your absolutely important point about the inequality of power and how can we make possible that the US is getting out of the stranglehold of the oligopolistic group? How can we imagine that, given that there is now a group running the country which does everything in order to maintain this sort of oligopolistic structure that you talked about? So that's just the how question. And the how question also refers to another issue. But I stop here. I mean, I just would like to hear a little bit more. What kind of opportunities do you see to get out of those things, those elements that you describe, which are not only features of the status quo, but which are features that seem to be produced by a self-reinforcing dynamic?
Maybe two other questions and comments. Wolfgang Merkel.
Hi, Timothy. Nice to see you and nice to listen to you. I have two brief questions. The first one was when you argued we have, or liberals have to rethink the relation between minority and majority. We used to judge the degree of liberalism of political regimes very much in how far and how much they protected minorities. Does it mean you think we are relying too much on this, focusing too much on this question and are neglecting majorities? This would be somehow new in liberal theory, according to my point of view. The second one is, could one argue, and this is related to the pandemic crisis of Corona, could one argue liberalism is a suitable ideology, program, and government for normal times, and it doesn't suit very much in times of deep crisis?
Good one. And the final remark by Clemens Schneider.
Yeah, please forgive me, Timothy, for being a little bit polemic now, but the baskets you lay in front of us, I had the impression you wanted liberalism to solve the problems of all kinds of political parties, of the more socialist one, of the conservative one, of the green one. But isn't there already a sort of a division of labor in the political process where we could say, well, the equality question, basic income or whatever, is something socialists are caring about and they will bring it into the process, but our part as liberals is maybe a little bit smaller. It's not about solving all the different issues, but instead bringing our set of values and convictions into those discussions whenever it comes to, for example, the equality question, but we don't have to solve every question.
Oh, this is provoking me to add another question to Timothy. I would frame it a little bit different. I would totally agree that liberalism has to answer also questions traditionally raised by socialists and by conservatives. Yeah, liberalism has to address the equality issue, the security issue, the community issue, but I would like to ask you, Timothy, yes, especially if we focus now on the equality basket, what are the specific liberal answers to these topics and sentiments usually addressed by other political traditions? Yeah, so what is the specific liberal answer to the growing disequality of property, of opportunities, of power, to the social polarization in our societies. And then, of course, we could widen the spectrum on, we already tried to do it on climate change and other challenges, to find a specific liberal approach to the agenda you have been unfolded.
Well, thank you all very much. What a terrific set of comments / questions. I omitted to say something which goes some way to address the last two questions at the very beginning. And this is something one can say more easily in English than in German, which is I am very consciously talking about what I would call small L liberalism rather than big L liberalism, right? In other words, I'm talking about, and by the way, if you look at, as in sort of Koselekian fashion, at the emergence of usages of the term liberal, it is increasingly clear that coming into our time, actually from post-45, increasingly the small L usage becomes quite prevalent, meaning defending notions of liberal democracy, which might be shared equally by a liberal conservative, a liberal social democrat, you know, a liberal Christian Democrat, and so on. So that I think there's a distinct question of the relationship between big L liberal parties in the Liberal International and the broader small L liberal. But this goes both to Michael Zorn's point and to Wolfgang's point, which is I don't think liberals are going to be enough to defend liberalism. Precisely in this very difficult position with these great entrenched inequalities of power, precisely in these abnormal times, Wolfgang, you actually, in my view, do need a kind of popular front politics. You need the widest possible small L alliance to effect change and to stand up to the populists and the nationalists. Now, Michael, I have to say, in all honesty, I don't have a complete answer to your question, because am I persuaded that a popular front politics, which we know from history is very difficult to do and to sustain, is actually enough to break those very strong plutocratic corporate inequalities of power? I'm not sure that I am convinced of that, except to say that there are so many losers in our society, including so much of the younger generation, intergenerational inequality, that at a certain point, if we still have free and fair elections, the combination of popular front politics and this cohort coming through and voting, which they don't do enough of at present, is the best answer I can come up with. But it's a great question, and as I say, I don't have a very simple answer. Wolfgang, to your second, or rather your first point, of course, and I think I said it, crucial to liberalism has always been standing up to the rights of minorities, and therefore to anti-majoritarian institutions and checks and balances. But the framing of the period of multiculturalism and liberal multiculturalism, which was secure majority, insecure oppressed minority, is, it seems to me, no longer sociologically adequate to our societies, which certainly in Western Europe, certainly in Northwestern Europe, are so mixed and so genuinely multicultural and diverse that you don't have that stark division between secure, white majority and minorities anymore. And in many respects, for example, educational disadvantage, the white working class in Britain are amongst the most educationally disadvantaged and the poorest performing. So that I think one has, while keeping the defense of minorities, to move back to a more classic liberal position of equal liberty under the law and equal liberty for all. That I think is the best I can do, but very importantly, not yielding to the pure majoritarian temptation. Because, I always like to say that Jarosław Kaczynski in Poland is essentially practicing what British constitutional doctrine preaches. Right? So British constitutional doctrine preaches, as you know, that Parliament is completely sovereign with no constraints, particularly after Brexit. And if the Parliament legislated that all red-bearded persons should be decapitated, then all red-bearded persons should be decapitated, right? That in practice, in the British Constitution, in the real unwritten Constitution, there are so many checks and balances. The trouble is those checks and balances are not so strong in Poland. Finally, Lasha, coming in reverse order, Russia is, as you say in Germany, ein abendfüllendes Thema. I mean, there's so much to be said about it. But I actually think, I'm going to risk saying this, whereas 5 or 10 years ago, around the time of Ukraine, when Russian disinformation was at its most effective, where Putin was actually standing up for the anti-liberal ideological mix, I would have said Russia was a very big threat. Now, in a curious way, I think both China and, believe it or not, Hungary are bigger challenges to liberal democracy. Because Hungary, though very small, is a member state of the European Union. This is a country inside the ultimate liberal democratic club, which is very aggressively as Putin, advancing the same anti-liberal ideological mix. And in terms of global strategic ideological competition, it's absolutely clear that China is a much bigger challenge, much more attractive to people in Latin America and Africa than Russia, the petrol state, the petrol authoritarianism of Russia ever is. Finally, to your point about media, look, this I hope we can talk a bit more about, because it seems to me absolutely crucial. Free speech is obviously essential to democracy. Traditionally, liberals have looked to dangers to free speech, above all, from the state. These days, the threat is not so much censorship, except in countries like China, it's ownership. It's control by ownership. And the oligarchic model of media owners, I see you nodding, and politicians completely intertwined, as in Turkey, as in Hungary, as in many other places, goes along with the destruction of the traditional business model of the newspaper, which amazingly for 150 years produced the public good of news by private means, right? So the answer to that is, in briefest summary, we need a mixed economy of media. And that has 3 components. Private ownership, still very important, open brackets, difficult question, foreign ownership. From where I sit in Oxford, foreign ownership is a big problem, because if we hadn't had Rupert Murdoch owning the Times and the Sun, we might not have had Brexit. When I sit in Warsaw, foreign ownership is part of the solution. Because if we didn't have TVN owned by the Discovery Channel, Onet owned by a German owner, and Gazeta Wyborcza owned by Agora with foreign shareholders, the independent media would virtually cease to exist. So, but that's just in brackets. But private ownership, then crucially public service media. If you have genuine public service media like Germany and Britain, hang on to them for dear life, quadruple the budget, and ring-fence their independence even more, right? So that's part 2. Part 3 is foundation NGO funding. This, in my view, has now to be an essential part of the mixed economy of supporting media on a much larger scale than before, because there are certain areas like in-depth investigative reporting and foreign reporting, which are extremely expensive, and in my view, apart from the public service media, can only be funded by foundation funding. So So that's, in briefest outline, my answer to your question. Very, very important. Mixed economy, the three pillars.
Thanks a lot. More comments and questions? Amit Shai, yeah. So,
allow me to frame my question in the following fashion. Regarding the strategy of the battle, it's a sort of a battle plan you laid down there. It seems to me that in basket number 2, we are inevitably pushing an alliance between the corporate and the populist. Because we're attacking the corporate and we are also hitting on the populist. And these two are adversaries within the camp. And then basket number 3 is rather the adversary outside the camp. So I'm questioning here the strategy. Is it very wise, really, to hit on everybody in one go? Or rather, have a strategy of isolating one after the other? So living with the evils of basket number 2 to win over number 3 and then deal with them, or the other way around. What do you think?
Thanks a lot. Amit Shah again.
Thank you very much, Timothy. Good to see you again. We met at Stanford a couple of times, and I know you know the United States very well. I'm here, Amichai Magen, from based in Herzliya, Israel at the moment. I want to ask you a question about the United States. I mean, the United States was really the engine of the last great liberal leap forward, fueled in many cases by Jewish refugees from Vienna and Berlin, as we know, but it was really the United States that was the engine for ideas, but also for the institutions and the power that drove the last great leap forward, if you like. Sorry, that's the wrong term for liberals to use, but you get the idea. And now we're in a very, very different situation. How do we think about the role of the United States in a new wave of liberal renewal? Is the United States still the indispensable nation for liberal renewal, or can we see somebody else taking on the leadership in terms not so much of ideas, but in terms of institutional innovation and the power to underwrite the massive kind of renaissance of liberalism that you envisage? How are you thinking about the United States in this context?
Other questions and comments? Helene von Bismarck, please.
Well, thank you, Timothy. And can I just applaud your plea for to resist the allure of majoritarianism and to make also a plea for small L liberalism. I really couldn't agree more. I wanted to raise a point with you, which you've made in several interviews and also in a talk of yours that I attended recently, about the allure of populism being not just rooted in economic problems, but also as a problem, I think you called it a problem of consciousness. And what you meant, or what I think you meant, was that, for example, in areas in Germany where there are very few foreigners or immigrants, these are the areas where the appeal of the AfD is at the highest and where people are most sympathetic to xenophobic ideas. And this idea, which was quite popular directly after the Brexit vote, that people would be drawn to populism because they had economic problems, that really is just a very small part of it. And we have to talk about those who are actually sometimes leading populist movements and who are actually very economically comfortable. So how do we address this problem of consciousness? What do we do against it?
Thank you very much. Helene von Bismarck sounds even more British than Timothy.
I'm sorry.
And now Lars Peter Nordbacken from Oslo.
Yes, hello. Thank you so much for an interesting speech. I would like to problematize one question about globalization, deceleration, things going too fast, and so on. As I understand it, there's a great dilemma to compatibility, if you will, with the baskets you mentioned concerning the need for providing life chances to everyone to lift up even geographically. And indeed, to solve the climate change problem, it needs a lot of investments, and growth is really part of a very of the solution as I see it. But I also, of course, I'm coming from a Norwegian perspective, Nordic perspective, and it seems to me that that problem basket is there is an interesting trade-off between that problem and if you have another situation where social cohesion and geographical inequality is much, much lower, like we have in Norway and in the Scandinavian countries. An interesting thing, we don't have that anti-globalization at all. So these there are trade-offs, and I want to comment on that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Back to Timothy, and then I think we have the opportunity for a final short round. Timothy, please.
Yes, let me say before I forget, since several of you described this as a manifesto, that it is a kind of manifesto, and actually it will appear enriched by this conversation in a forthcoming issue of the Monthly Prospect. Lars, just briefly, absolutely, there are those complex trade-offs. And all I would say, since you touched on the climate change point, is that the problem of domestic legitimacy is bound up very much with having an answer on the climate change question. So as I said in my project at Oxford, we're doing a lot of polling on this subject. There's a lot of other polling to go with it. It is so high up on the agenda, particularly of younger Europeans, but actually of all Europeans, that no system is going to be legitimate longer term unless it addresses that question. Where it becomes really difficult is if the agenda of jobs and social security, life chances, comes into direct conflict with the genuine carbon consumption issue. So that's on that one. Helena, who is of course much more British than me, absolutely. What I said was that it seemed to me that having got rid of Marxist regimes in Europe, we liberals then went on to make the Marxist mistake. And the fundamental Marxist mistake was to believe that being always determines consciousness. Right. Whereas, of course, it's also the other way around. And that's precisely what we see in East Germany, where in poll after poll, people say we're doing fine economically, but we feel we're being treated as second-class citizens, and that's why we're voting for the AfD. So that is indeed part of the point. And therefore, the community and identity side of this agenda, somewhere around liberal patriotism, somewhere around creating an inclusive we, which, put it crudely, white working class people in the poorer parts of our countries feel part of, has to be part of the answer. And in my view, it needs a new Willy Brandt to really shape that rhetorically. So then if I go back to the first question, because it connects to the trade-offs, I mean, I've already indicated one reason why I don't think we can simply concentrate on basket 1 or 1 and 2 and ignore basket 3, because the planet will just be in an absolutely terrible state in 20 years' time if we do. And that will mean that we have to erect a new Berlin Wall around rich and free countries and shoot people at the wall. And that seems to me morally unacceptable, or take in vast numbers of climate refugees. So I don't think you can exclude from your battle plan, as you put it, for new liberalism, basket 3. Where I fundamentally disagree with you is to think that the corporate interests and the populist interest are currently separate and at loggerheads, and therefore it's a mistake to take them both on. I think precisely the reverse is the case. Donald Trump is not a poor man. He is a corporate man. Fox News is a corporation, a very profitable corporation, and a key pillar of his powers, as is News International. It is precisely this fateful nexus between corporate and populist power, and its majoritarian justification, let me add. We won the election so we can do whatever we like, including preventing you being able to win the next election, that we have to break. So I do think, difficult though it is, we have to have a strategy that acts on all fronts. Strategy. Whether you fight each battle on all fronts is a different question, right? That's a different question. I can see that you might want to fight an individual election on a few specific issues where you're going to win, but behind that you have to have a strategy. By the way, just to mention again Keir Starmer, I think this is exactly what Keir Starmer is doing. He's actually leaving aside many of these difficult issues, advancing a strategy of liberal patriotism, which is going to win him the next election, which I think it will, and then he'll address those other issues. Finally, to Amichai, by the way, when you said that this was the work of Jewish refugees from Vienna, let me remind you of the obituary of Karl Popper in the Financial Times, which began, like most British intellectuals of his generation, Karl Popper was born in Vienna. So it's not just the United States, it's also the UK. I think this is a huge, huge problem, because as you rightly say, so much of what has been achieved with what John Eikenberry called the liberal Leviathan in the background, the liberal Leviathan, the United States. And what I would say to you is I absolutely do not think that the United States can anymore function as the indispensable nation for liberal renewal. We've got to go about that ourselves, because I think the structural problems of American society, from healthcare, the disastrous position in healthcare, to the failed infrastructure, to the acute hyperpolarization, to the educational deprivation of a large part of the society, to the problem of race, which amazingly has still not been solved despite having the first black president, are so deep that I just don't see, even if we have 12 years of Democrat administrations and wonderful Kamala Harris as president for 2 terms, I still don't see it becoming the city on the hill again, the shining model. So I think we've got to do that ourselves. But what I do think is that the United States remains the indispensable nation for liberal security. If I were Estonia, I wouldn't rely on Western Europe to defend me against Russia. And if I'm Taiwan, Portugal is, or indeed the EU, is certainly not going to defend me against China. So not indispensable nation for liberal renewal, but indispensable nation for liberal security.
Thank you very much, Timothy. Unfortunately, we are already running out of time. I just would make some brief final remarks beyond thanking you all for your participation, the long day, all your contributions, your thoughts, your passion. For me, this was a quite encouraging experience. I agree very much with this enlightening differentiation Timothy made between the big L and the small L liberal. We, as the Center for Liberal Modernity, we see us as a kind of hub for liberal minds in all democratic political families. trying to strengthen liberal thinking and liberal policy approaches across the party spectrum. And I think creating this kind of alliances, this is what we need to answer the populist and anti-liberal challenge. In substance, I just wanted to highlight one aspect of this extreme rich menu we have been discussing now with Timothy. I stumbled a little bit, as Lars Peter Nordbacken, about your term deceleration. Yeah, and of course I see the rationale in that. If you democracy is about collectively shaping developments which are have a deep impact on the life of individuals and societies, and this demands a certain degree of control over these developments. And of course, if they spiral out of control, migration, climate change, international conflict, and everything is happening in parallel at the same time, you will have kind of overstretch of democratic capacities, an overstretch of the ability to manage and to shape these developments in a democratic way, and this will foster authoritarian tendencies. But at the same time, I'm a little bit skeptical if we really will be able to decelerate these developments. My guess would be on the contrary, that we are facing even an accelerating period of change in all aspects in the next 20, 30 years. Disruption of the international order, the digital revolution, you mentioned artificial intelligence, climate change, all this kind of stuff. And I think in my view, the challenge is first to create the kind of institutions and safeguards which enable our societies and which enable every individual in our societies to keep pace with these changes and to provide a basic level of security within these periods of change, and on the other hand, to enable our societies to even to speed up innovation. Innovation in a very broad sense of the term, not only technology-wise, but also in terms of social and political innovations. And if I refer to a very special issue and passion of mine, climate change. Climate change is not about, or the answer to climate change is not about decelerating innovation, it's about accelerating innovation. We have to speed up the departure from fossil fuels and all the things which are connected to it. So I think the balance between accelerated change, the capacity to innovate, and at the same time to provide this sense of security, of belonging, of solidarity, of social coherence. This is one of the core challenges we are facing, and we would suggest to continue this kind of consultation and deliberation we had today, then to more specific challenges. What are liberal answers to these basic changes and basic challenges we are facing for the next decades? And look really for policy answers. This is not only about values and ideas, it's about policy. So thank you very much to all of you, and we are very happy that this experiment finally played out quite well to combine this offline and online conversation, and to have all of you present from all over Europe and Israel here in Berlin, at least virtually. We very much would like to continue this kind of networking events, and yeah, stay safe and all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you.